Working with Azure Storage accounts. In this short video, we're going to look at Azure Storage accounts and the different redundancy options. If you choose the standard performance option, and that's equivalent to what used to be called the general purpose V2 storage account, then by default you'll get Geo-Redundant Storage, which is about the most expensive. So what are the options? If you click on the redundancy property, you'll see there are actually 4 choices. In addition, if you choose one of the Geo-Redundant storage options, you'll see a checkbox that allows you to choose Read Access. So here's a list of the 6 storage options available for the standard storage tier. There's locally redundant, zone redundant, geo-redundant and Geo-Zone-Redundant, and then each of the Geo options can have a read access version as well. As we work down the list, the data is more available and secure, but of course the storage costs are higher as well. Now just be aware that if you choose some of the premium storage tiers, you won't get all of these choices. So let's look at the options in more detail. The least expensive option is locally redundant storage, or LRS, and that just means we have 3 copies of our data stored inside a single data center. If anything goes wrong with the data center as a whole, then we lose access to our data, and potentially if it was a catastrophic disaster, then we might lose the data. Now within the data center, the 3 copies will be on different racks, which means separate power supply and cooling. This is already probably better than we could manage if we maintained our own data center. Microsoft claim 99.999999999, that's 11 nines availability, but nevertheless they only recommend locally redundant storage if you have a way of restoring the data, for example if it can be reconstructed from source or restored from backup. For some organizations, that risk of the loss of an entire data center is too high, and so Microsoft offer Geo-Redundant Storage, or GRS, which takes advantage of the global distribution of data centers in Azure, shown by these green and blue dots. We get 3 copies at our primary data center, which is the same as LRS, but in addition we get a second paired region. We effectively get another LRS in the second region, giving 6 copies in total. Region pairs are defined within a geography, and they're usually hundreds of miles apart, and that means that replication is asynchronous. If an entire data center is lost, it fails over to the secondary region. This can be initiated by Microsoft or the customer and can take up to an hour. GRS offers extremely high reliability, 99.99, well, there's 16 nines. But because the replication is asynchronous, there's still a possibility of data loss, as the secondary can be up to 15 minutes behind the primary. Now, some of these regions support something called availability zones, and these are the green dots on the map, a little under half of all the regions. These regions have 3 or more zones that are separate data centers within the region. They have separate power, cooling and networking, and are usually on separate physical sites, but close enough to support synchronous replication over low latency connections. Like locally redundant storage and zone redundant storage gives us 3 copies of the data, but they're distributed across the 3 zones, so a failure of a data center doesn't result in service interruption or data loss, giving us 12 nines. There's always a possibility, a remote possibility, that a failure or disaster could take out all 3 zones, so there's a final option called Geo-Zone-Redundant Storage. GZRS combines the best of both of the previous options by having ZRS in the primary regions and LRS in the second region, giving synchronous replication with the addition of protection against a disaster that takes out the whole of the primary region. Like GRS, GZRS gives us 6 copies total and the maximum amount of protection. If you're using either of the geo-redundant options, then you'd normally only have access to the primary region. Azure will continue to do asynchronous replication to the secondary region, but under normal circumstances you don't get to see it. If a disaster occurs in the primary region, then Azure will fail over to the second region and you'd be switched over to it automatically. Read access allows you to proactively read data from the secondary region if you want to. For example, you might decide you want to be in control of the failover process rather than rely on Azure. Both GRS and GZRS have read access versions, which is also the most expensive. So choosing the right redundancy option means making a trade-off. Ultimately, you need to consider how much it would cost to recreate the data if it were ever lost, and also the costs around temporary loss of access, and weigh that up against the storage costs for each of the options.